you making out? How are you making out? We are holding our own. Those were the last words the world ever heard from Captain Ernest McSorley of the Edmund Fitzgerald. 10 minutes later, she disappeared. No distress call, no lifeboats launched, no survivors. 730 feet of steel. 29 men. Gone in under 10 minutes. A ship built to withstand the worst November storms on the Great Lakes. Erased. This was not a routine sinking. This was a violent failure. So what happened in those final moments? What force can tear apart a steel giant so completely that no one escapes? Stay with me, because I firmly believe that the answer is not simple, not comfortable, and not something everyone agrees on. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on June 7, 1958, before more than 15,000 spectators in River Rouge, Michigan. From the moment she slid sideways into the water, she was not just another freighter. At 730 feet long, 75 feet wide, and standing nearly 39 feet from keel to deck, she was the largest ship ever to sail the Great Lakes at the time of her construction. She was built deliberately, within a single foot of the maximum size allowed to pass through the St. Lawrence Seaway. She displaced 13,632 gross registered tons and could carry over 26,000 long tons of taconite iron ore in a single voyage. This was not a fragile vessel. She was valued at $7 million in 1958, a staggering investment, commissioned by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, a financial giant. She was engineered by Great Lakes Engineering Works to dominate the inland seas. Her steam turbines drove her at a service speed of 14 knots. She carried 72,000 gallons of fuel. She was efficient, powerful, and modern. But beyond size and numbers, she carried symbolism. They called her the Queen of the Lakes. And for years, she earned that title. By 1969, she set a single-trip cargo record of 27,402 long tons. Over the next decade and a half, she would break seasonal cargo haul records 6 separate times. She became the flagship of the Columbia transportation fleet. Crowds gathered at the Soo locks just to watch her pass. Captain Peter Pulser would stand in the pilot house and speak to spectators through a bullhorn, proudly announcing the details of his magnificent ship. And she was not merely working the lakes, she was celebrated on them. For 17 years, she ran a relentless route between Superior, Wisconsin and ports like Detroit and Toledo. By November of 1975, she had completed 748 round trips. She had traveled over 1 million miles on freshwater, the equivalent of circling the globe more than 40 times. And during that entire career, she suffered nothing catastrophic. Yes, she had incidents. She ran aground in 1969. She collided with another vessel in 1970. She struck lock walls on a few occasions, but these were not signs of weakness. On the Great Lakes, such events were considered routine wear in a harsh environment. Freshwater vessels, unlike ocean ships, were expected to last half a century or more. In fact, in 1969, the Fitzgerald received a safety award for 8 consecutive years of operation without a lost time injury. 8 years. That is not luck. That is discipline. That is confidence, reinforced by performance. By the time Captain Ernest McSorley took command during her later years, the Fitzgerald was not viewed as vulnerable. She was viewed as reliable, strong, proven, nearly unsinkable. And that is where the human story begins to matter. Because when a vessel performs successfully for nearly 2 decades, when she survives storm after storm, season after season, something subtle begins to happen. Confidence hardens, risk feels manageable. Weather becomes something to endure, not something to fear. By November 9th, 1975, when the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin at 2:15 p.m., loaded with 26,116 long tons of iron ore bound for Zug Island near Detroit, she was not embarking on a reckless voyage. She was doing what she had done hundreds of times before. A routine run, a familiar storm season, a proven ship. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so devastating. On Sunday, November 9th, 1975, at 2:15 p.m., the SS Edmund Fitzgerald departed the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin. She was loaded with 26,116 long tons of taconite iron ore pellets, bound for Zug Island near Detroit, a journey of just over 1,000 miles that typically took about 47 hours. Nothing about the departure suggested disaster. The lake was relatively calm. Forecasts called for increasing winds the following day, but nothing outside what seasoned Great Lakes captains routinely handled in November. Storms were expected, but expected storms were part of the job. This was not reckless navigation. This was routine. But the Fitzgerald was sailing heavy. Over the years, load line regulations had been relaxed, allowing Great Lakes freighters to ride deeper in the water. By 1975, the Fitzgerald was permitted to sail approximately 4 feet lower than when she was first launched in 1958. On that November afternoon, she was near maximum allowable draft. More cargo meant more profit. It also meant less margin. By early evening on November 9th, weather bulletins began to shift. The National Weather Service upgraded gale warnings to storm warnings. Winds were building faster than predicted. A powerful low-pressure system had formed over Kansas and was intensifying rapidly as it moved northeast toward Lake Superior. By the early morning hours of November 10th, sustained winds across the lake were reaching 50 knots, nearly 60 miles per hour, with gusts approaching hurricane force. Waves were building to 25 feet, then 30 feet. Some reports estimated 35-foot seas. Lake Superior is not a small body of water. It offers over 300 miles of open fetch, uninterrupted wind that allows waves to grow larger and more violent than many inland mariners ever experience. At 7 a.m. on Monday, November 10th, the Fitzgerald was roughly 1/3 of the way across Lake Superior. Captain Ernest McSorley altered course slightly to take advantage of the Canadian shoreline, seeking some protection from the full force of the northwesterly winds. Behind her, about 10 to 15 miles back, the freighter Arthur M. Anderson, commanded by Captain Bernie Cooper, followed the same strategy. By midday, the storm had intensified dramatically. Around 1:50 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson reporting that the Fitzgerald had developed a list. He also stated they had lost their number 1 radar. The second radar soon failed as well. Now they were navigating blind in snow and heavy seas. Visibility had dropped severely. Snow squalls and spray erased the horizon. Without radar, the crew had to rely on dead reckoning and position reports from the Anderson. By mid-afternoon, McSorley reported additional damage. The ship had lost 2 vent covers, allowing water to enter ballast tanks. Both bilge pumps were running continuously. He reported taking on water. When asked if he needed assistance, McSorley replied that they were managing. At 3:30 p.m., he told the Anderson they were holding their own. But the situation was deteriorating. The Fitzgerald, already riding low due to heavy cargo, was now battling massive seas that were washing over the deck. Each wave added thousands of tons of transient weight as water surged across the hatches. The ship was designed to flex. Long freighters bend in heavy seas. But flexing has limits. By 6 p.m., winds were estimated at 50 to 60 knots. The Anderson later reported 2 massive waves around 6:30 p.m. and that were the biggest seas Captain Cooper had ever witnessed on the Great Lakes. He would later wonder if those same waves overtook the Fitzgerald. At 7:10 p.m., in what would become one of the most haunting radio exchanges in maritime history, Captain Cooper contacted the Fitzgerald. "How are you making out?" Captain McSorley responded calmly, "We are holding our own." There was no panic in his voice, no distress signal joy, no mayday. That transmission ended at approximately 7:10 p.m. At 7:20 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson lost sight of the Fitzgerald on radar. 10 minutes. That is all it took. No explosion was reported. No debris field was immediately visible. No lifeboats were seen deployed. By 7:30 p.m., as the storm began to slowly ease, the Fitzgerald was gone. 730 feet of steel. 29 crew members. Vanished in less time than it takes to boil water. Search efforts began quickly, but they found only floating debris, life rings, broken planks, fragments of a once mighty vessel. There were no survivors, and here is what makes those final minutes so chilling. There was no prolonged distress call, no extended struggle, no drawn-out sinking visible to another vessel. Something happened rapidly, catastrophically, and decisively. The storm did not gradually claim her. It overwhelmed her. By the time the radar screen went blank at 7:20 p.m., the clock had already run out. The question is not whether the storm was severe. The records prove it was. The question is this: what happened in those final 10 minutes that transformed a 17-year veteran of Lake Superior into a grave on the lakebed? Because from 7:10 p.m. to 7:20 p.m., something crossed the line from survivable into fatal. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was discovered on November 14, 1975, just 4 days after she vanished, by a U.S. Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft, using magnetic anomaly detection equipment. She lies in 530 feet of water. That is more than 160 meters below the surface. At that depth, the water temperature hovers just above freezing. There are no currents strong enough to scatter wreckage far. The fresh water preserves steel differently than saltwater oceans. What sank in 1975 still rests there in stark clarity. And what investigators saw was not what many expected. The Fitzgerald was not lying intact. She was broken in two. The bow section, roughly 276 feet long, sits upright, embedded deep into the mud. It is angled downward as if it drove into the lake bed with forward momentum. The stern section, approximately 253 feet long, lies nearly inverted, twisted, collapsed, inward. Between them, a debris field stretching roughly 170 to 200 feet, steel plating shredded, decking peeled back, frames twisted. This was not a clean structural snap. It was violent separation. The area between the bow and stern is described by divers and investigators as no man's land, a chaotic zone of crumpled steel, hatch covers, structural beams, and torn plating. If the ship had simply filled with water and sunk intact, breaking only upon impact with the lake bed, investigators would expect a different pattern. They would expect compression damage at the bow. They would expect crushing consistent with bottom impact. But what they found was tensile failure, metal pulled apart, steel curled outward, hull plating separated along weld lines. The center of the ship, around the cargo holds, appears to have suffered catastrophic structural failure. And here is what makes that detail critical. Long freighters flex in heavy seas. The Edmund Fitzgerald was 729 feet long. When one wave lifts the bow and another lifts the stern, the midsection experiences enormous stress, called hogging when the center bends upward, and sagging when it bends downward. These stresses are normal, within limits. But on November 10th, 1975, waves were reported between 25 and 35 feet. Some models suggest waves exceeding 40 feet may have occurred. At that scale, the stresses multiply exponentially. The wreck suggests something exceeded those limits. And the distance between the two sections, hundreds of feet apart, raises a question. Did the ship break apart before it reached the bottom? Because if separation occurred only after impact, gravity would likely pull both halves down closer together. Instead, the bow appears to have descended first, diving into the mud. The stern followed later, drifting slightly before settling. The debris field between them implies breakup during descent, or possibly at the surface, which brings us to a chilling precedent. And now, before we decide whether the Edmund Fitzgerald broke apart at the bottom or at the surface, we need to examine a case that already answered that question once before. Because 9 years earlier, in another November storm, another Great Lakes freighter did something investigators once thought nearly impossible. It broke in half on the surface on November 29th, 1966. The Daniel J. Morrell was crossing Lake Huron during what sailors call the Witch of November. She was 603 feet long, smaller than the Fitzgerald, but built with the same long, narrow Great Lakes design that makes these vessels vulnerable to midship stress in heavy seas. That night, winds exceeded 60 miles per hour. Waves built relentlessly in freezing darkness. And sometime after 2 a.m., the ship failed. The sole survivor, 26-year-old Dennis Hale, later described what he heard. He said the deck began tearing like a piece of paper. Not cracking, Not snapping, tearing. He described a violent metallic roar, steel ripping apart under stress. The bow separated from the stern while the ship was still on the surface. The stern section, with engines still running, continued moving briefly under its own power before it too disappeared into the storm. When the wreck was later located, the two halves were found more than 5 miles apart. 5 miles. That distance alone proved the breakup occurred above water. If the vessel had sunk intact and fractured on the bottom, the two sections would have settled much closer together. Investigators also noted something else. The catastrophic damage was concentrated in the midship cargo hold region, the structural spine of the vessel. Steel plates were torn, internal framing fractured. The failure was tensile, not compressive. The Morrell demonstrated something critical. In extreme November conditions, Great Lakes freighters can experience structural failure at the surface. Not from explosion, not from collision, but from wave-induced stress exceeding design tolerance. Now return to the Edmund Fitzgerald. A longer vessel, heavier cargo, riding deeper in the water due to regulatory changes, facing comparable, and possibly worse, storm conditions, and lying today in two distinct sections, separated by hundreds of feet, with catastrophic damage concentrated in the center. The parallels are uncomfortable. Both ships sailed in late November. Both encountered severe storm systems. Both show midship structural failure. The difference? The Morrell had a witness. The Fitzgerald had silence. And that silence is what forces us to consider the possibility that history may have repeated itself. Only this time, no one survived to describe the sound of steel tearing in the dark. So now we must confront the uncomfortable possibility. If the Fitzgerald did not simply flood and sink intact, if she did not merely strike the bottom and fracture, if her steel shows signs of violent tensile tearing, then what happened in those final 10 minutes? Let us consider the forces involved. A 730-foot ship weighing over 13,000 gross tons, carrying more than 26,000 long tons of iron ore, riding lower in the water than when originally designed due to regulatory changes, struck by sustained winds near 60 knots, battered by waves 25 to 35 feet high, possibly encountering a rogue wave exceeding 40 feet. When a long vessel spans two wave crests with a trough in the middle, the center experiences downward bending stress. If that stress exceeds yield strength, steel does not politely crack, it tears. Weld seams, particularly 1950s era scalloped weld joints, can become fracture initiation points. And once a crack begins under load, propagation can be rapid, measured in seconds, which would explain the silence. No prolonged mayday, no drawn-out distress. Just a calm voice at 7:10 p. Mitch Wim. We are holding our own. And 10 minutes later, nothing. If structural failure occurred suddenly amidships, the ship could have broken rapidly. The bow, heavily loaded with cargo, might have plunged forward. The stern, engines still running, could have remained briefly buoyant. Then gravity and water would finish what stress began. The wreck does not prove definitively that breakup occurred at the surface, but it strongly challenges the idea that she sank whole. And so we are left with the question that defines this tragedy. What force is powerful enough to tear apart a steel vessel longer than 2 football fields? Was it gradual flooding? Was it structural fatigue accumulated over 17 years? Was it regulatory overloading Or was it something far more violent? A rare, massive wave event capable of exceeding design limits in seconds? For nearly 50 years, experts, engineers, meteorologists, sailors, and families have wrestled with one central question. What actually caused the Edmund Fitzgerald to fail? There is no single answer that satisfies everyone. Instead, there are competing forces: mechanical, environmental, and human, each claiming part of the story. First, human error. The U.S. Coast Guard conclusion. In 1977, after 2 years of investigation, the United States Coast Guard Marine Board of Inquiry issued its official conclusion. Their finding: the Fitzgerald likely sank due to massive flooding of the cargo holds caused by improperly secured hatch covers. The theory was straightforward. As waves of 25 to 35 feet crashed over the deck, water forced its way past the hatch clamps. Once inside the cargo holds, thousands of tons of water would accumulate. The added weight would cause the bow to ride lower, increasing stress and eventually leading to sinking. Once the vessel reached the bottom, they argued, the impact caused the hull to break apart. Simple, logical, and deeply controversial, because this conclusion effectively implied crew error. It suggested that the 29 men on board, experienced Great Lakes sailors, failed to properly secure the 21 cargo hatch covers before departure. Families of the crew strongly rejected this claim. So did several maritime experts. Later testing of hatch covers under simulated wave pressure suggested that even if some clamps were loose, the amount of water entering would have been limited. Certainly not enough to sink a 730-foot vessel in 10 minutes. And Captain McSorley's final communications did not indicate catastrophic flooding. He reported taking water. He did not report uncontrollable inundation. So while the Coast Guard's theory remains part of the official record, it has never fully satisfied critics. Second, extreme wave stress. The storm itself. On November 10, 1975, sustained winds were recorded between 50 and 60 knots, near hurricane force. Wave heights were officially reported at 25 feet, with some estimates reaching 35 feet. NOAA later conducted computer modeling of the storm system. Their simulations demonstrated that the Fitzgerald was in one of the worst possible positions on Lake Superior, exposed to a long fetch of over 300 miles, allowing wave energy to build continuously. Long vessels like the Fitzgerald experience tremendous bending forces in such seas. When the bow is lifted by one wave and the stern by another, the midsection becomes the hinge point. If wave amplitude and frequency align in the wrong pattern, structural stress can exceed yield strength. The NOAA modeling suggested that the stresses were physically capable of pushing the hull beyond design limits. This theory does not rely on human failure. It relies on physics. But even here, the question remains. Was the storm severe enough by itself to destroy a vessel that had survived 17 previous Novembers? Next, third, rogue waves. The Three Sisters. For decades dismissed as maritime myth, rogue waves are now scientifically documented phenomena. They are defined as waves more than twice the significant wave height of the surrounding sea. In a storm producing 25-foot waves, a rogue wave could exceed 50 feet. On the Great Lakes, sailors speak of the Three Sisters, a sequence of three massive waves that strike in rapid succession. The first weakens the vessel. The second floods the deck. The third overwhelms it. NOAA meteorological analysis indicates that the 1975 storm had conditions capable of producing extreme wave interference patterns, where multiple wave systems combine into a single, towering wall of water. A wave of that magnitude striking the Fitzgerald could have buried the bow while simultaneously lifting or twisting the stern. For a vessel already riding low due to heavy cargo, that could be catastrophic. The terrifying part? A rogue wave does not announce itself. It appears, it strikes, it disappears, measured in seconds, which would align with the silence between 7:10 p.m. and 7:20 p.m. Fourth, surface breakup. Structural failure before sinking. The sonar evidence shows catastrophic midship damage. The debris field between the bow and stern suggests violent separation before final impact. The Daniel J. Morrell precedent proves that Great Lakes freighters can break apart on the surface under extreme wave stress. If the Fitzgerald experienced sagging stress beyond design tolerance, a fracture could have initiated along weld seams, particularly the scalloped weld joints common in 1950s shipbuilding. Once fracture begins under load, propagation can be rapid. Seconds. If the hull failed suddenly amidships, the bow, heavily loaded with 26,000 tons of ore, could have plunged forward, cannot. The stern may have remained buoyant briefly. Then gravity and flooding would finish the process. This theory aligns with the wreck pattern, but it still leaves open what triggered the failure. Storm stress alone, or something more concentrated? Fifth, design and structural factors. The Fitzgerald was 729 feet long, meaning nearly the length of a 70-story building laid on its side, extremely long for a freshwater vessel in 1958. Her length made her efficient. It also made her susceptible to bending moments. Her hull plating incorporated scallop weld joints, a design that later engineering practice recognized as potential fracture initiation points. Additionally, regulatory changes over time allowed her to sail approximately 4 feet deeper than originally designed. Reduced freeboard means more water washing over the deck. More water means more transient weight. More weight means greater stress. None of these factors alone guarantee failure, but together they reduce safety margin. Sixth, above-deck damage and stability loss. Captain McSorley reported the loss of 2 vent covers. Vent damage allows water into ballast tanks. Water in ballast tanks shifts weight distribution. Combined with continuous deck flooding and pumps running full capacity, stability decreases. Even a small list in heavy seas increases asymmetric stress on the hull. Investigators examining later footage noted damage to railings and deck structures, consistent with heavy wave impact. These details matter because structural failure rarely comes from one cause. It comes from accumulation. Finally, here is the uncomfortable truth. No single theory stands strong alone. Not human error, not storm severity, not rogue waves, not design flaws. But when combined, heavy cargo, reduced freeboard, extreme sustained winds, possible rogue wave impact, midship structural vulnerability, progressive water ingress, sudden stress exceedance, then the scenario becomes plausible. And perhaps that is the hardest reality to accept. The Edmund Fitzgerald may not have been defeated by one mistake, or one wave, or one flaw. She may have been overwhelmed by a convergence, a perfect alignment of physics, weather, design, and timing. And somewhere in the darkness between 710 and 720 p.m., all of those forces met and the margin vanished. The Witch of November is not a legend created after tragedy. It is a meteorological reality that forms with brutal consistency over the Great Lakes. November storms develop when an Alberta clipper drives cold, dry Arctic air southward from Canada, while tether a Colorado low pulls warm, moist air northward from the Gulf of Mexico along the eastern slopes of the Rockies. When these two air masses collide over the still warm waters of the Great Lakes in late autumn, the lakes themselves feed the system. The retained summer heat rising from the water intensifies the low pressure from below, while the jet stream accelerates it from above. The result is a cyclonic storm system capable of producing sustained winds of 50 to 60 knots, rapid pressure drops comparable to a Category 1 hurricane, and waves that quickly build beyond 25 or 30 feet. In November 1975, the storm that overtook the Edmund Fitzgerald deepened as it tracked from Kansas on November 9th to Upper Michigan by the morning of November 10th, placing the vessel directly in the path of strengthening winds and rising seas. The Great Lakes are often mistaken for inland waters, yet in storm conditions they behave with the violence of an ocean and with unique dangers of their own. Lake Superior alone offers more than 300 miles of uninterrupted fetch, allowing wind to build steep, tightly spaced waves that rise faster than many mariners expect. Unlike long rolling ocean swells, Great Lakes waves are shorter and more abrupt, producing sharp troughs and peaks that strike in rapid succession. Ships have limited sea room to maneuver. They cannot alter course for days into open ocean, but must navigate between shorelines, shoals, and narrow approaches. In such confined yet powerful systems, wave interference can produce rogue waves, defined scientifically as waves more than twice the significant wave height. In a 25-foot sea state, that means a wall of water exceeding 50 feet. Sailors describe a pattern known as the Three Sisters, a sequence of three massive waves where the first destabilizes, the second floods, and the third overwhelms. Modern meteorology confirms that the atmospheric conditions present during severe November cyclones can support such extreme wave events. History demonstrates that the Fitzgerald was not alone in facing the Witch of November. From November 27th to 28th, 1905, the Maritime storm struck Lake Superior, damaging or destroying 29 vessels and killing 36 sailors, with losses exceeding $3.5 million in 1905 currency. In November 1913, the Great Lakes storm, later called the White Hurricane, raged from the 7th through the 10th, producing hurricane-force winds across 4 of the 5 lakes, sinking 19 ships and claiming more than 250 lives. Since formal records began in 1847, at least 25 major killer storms have struck during November. The pattern is consistent: intense low pressure, warm lake surfaces, violent wind shifts, and steep waves. The Fitzgerald entered that pattern on November 9, 1975, when she departed Superior at 2:15 p.m. with 26,116 long tons of taconite bound for Detroit. She did not sail into an unknown risk. She sailed into a season long recognized for volatility. That context does not excuse the outcome, but it clarifies the environment in which it occurred, which leads to the harder question that extends beyond meteorology. Who ultimately placed the ship in that environment? Captain Ernest McSorley was a seasoned 63-year-old master with decades of Great Lakes experience. His crew of 29 were accustomed to autumn voyages. The shipping season traditionally extended from April until freeze-up, and late November runs were common as companies sought to move cargo before winter closure. Regulatory adjustments over the years had allowed vessels such as the Fitzgerald to ride approximately 4 feet deeper than at launch, increasing cargo capacity but reducing freeboard. Storm warnings had been issued on November 9th, yet storms in November were not unusual. The voyage was considered routine within the culture of Great Lakes commerce. There is no clear evidence of reckless defiance, only a chain of accepted practices shaped by experience, economics, and confidence in steel. After November 10, 1975, change followed, though gradually. Navigation technology evolved. GPS would later replace dead reckoning in whiteout conditions. Emergency position indicating radio beacons allowed automatic distress transmission, even if a crew could not send a call. Survival suits became standard equipment, extending precious minutes in near-freezing water. Load line standards tightened and structural assessments improved. Weather forecasting models advanced with satellite data and better real-time storm tracking across the lakes. Search and rescue coordination became more integrated. These reforms were not abstract improvements but responses purchased at a cost of 29 lives. The bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald was recovered in 1995 and now tolls once for each crew member lost. The Witch of November still forms when cold Arctic air meets warm lake water, and steel still answers to physics. The Fitzgerald was part of a long history of storms, ships, and human ambition confronting natural force, and her loss remains a reminder that routine can turn irreversible when weather, design, and timing converge. Finally, thank you for staying with me through the story of Edmund Fitzgerald. If this episode moved you, I truly appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing so we can continue exploring the history behind these waters together. Your engagement helps keep these memories alive and these lessons remembered. Until our next story, take care of one another, and I'll see you soon.